Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Erin Miller, again from the Western Quebec School Board, and it is my absolute pleasure to be convening our closing keynote this afternoon with Bergman. It is my fourth year living and working in Gatineau, Quebec, which is part of the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin people. Along with the closely related Ojibwa and Odawa peoples, the Algonquin are part of the cultural group known as Anishinaabe. As a librarian, it's one of my responsibilities and one of my favorite things to introduce people to resources they can use to learn and hopefully share what they've learned. So today, I would like to share this book, Indigenous Ingenuity, a celebration of traditional North American knowledge by Deirdre Haverlock, Edward Kay, and illustrated by Kalila Fuller. It's a STEM book sharing Indigenous knowledge of things like transportation, agriculture, brain surgery, astronomy, and more. The book also includes activities and experiments for kids, so it would be wonderful for our littles in our younger elementary school libraries. And I just discovered that the book has been optioned for a 10-episode television series, which is fabulous news. The knowledge, the book, the show, it all sort of builds and grows. And it's important in that way to remember reconciliation is a verb, and we must all keep learning. So for the keynote, the Q&A feature will be available throughout. As Bear is giving his talk, if you have any questions that come to mind, feel free to put them into the Q&A, and then we'll look at them all together closer to the end of the hour, okay? And now, Bergman is busy. He's an author, storyteller, educator, publisher, and has a new book, Special Topics in Being a Parent, coming out in July of this year. It was a piece Bear wrote for PEN Canada that caught our eye for the symposium this year as we focused together on intellectual freedom. In the article, Bear wrote, "I am constantly concerned with what I have termed, quote, justice of the imagination, the critical responsibility of showing all kids that any kid can be the hero of a story," end quote. And as we've seen in the US, we learned about more for those of us who were in the panel discussion earlier this morning, more and more here in our own country, that there are those that would prevent those stories from reaching our students. And we wanted to know more about what Bear thought. And so we're so pleased that Bear is here with us today to present Justice of the Imagination and the Power of Celebration. Bear?
Thank you very much. I am so happy to be with you today. And I realize that that is a thing that people say whenever they start a talk, but I have to tell you, particularly when I'm talking about justice of the imagination and representation and why it's important, there's literally no group that I am happier to talk to about this thing than librarians. Partly because I know that this is also of considerable interest to you, but also partly because I can skip the whole part where I have to make the case that books are still important. I know you know they're important, and it's relaxing in a certain way to sit with people who share my belief that books can be transformative. So I really am legitimately and not at all euphemistically particularly happy to be with you today. In 2008, I received a phone call that changed my life. In 2008, people still talked on the phone. Perhaps some of you remember this. But I got a call from a friend of a friend, a guy named Will, who called to say, "Hello, I am aware that you are a writer and that you are interested in equity and justice. And I find myself with a problem that I can't solve, and I'm hoping you can help me. I am in charge of the children's programming at the biggest gender conference in North America. And we do activities during the day. Some of them are just, we run through the sprinklers and we draw things and we play, parachute games. But we also would really like to do a story time where we read some stories to the children that have positive gender messages, especially around trans kids and trans people generally. But none of the books that currently exist are really positive in the way we would like. Would you consider writing a story or some stories that we could read to the children that would be empowering for a trans kid, or for a kid that has trans siblings or trans parents? I'm a writer, and I had not previously worked in children's literature. Like a lot of writers, I didn't really understand how complex and interesting children's literature is, and how different it is from writing or telling stories for adults. But writers are like actors in a certain way. When they ask you, can you ride a horse? You say, oh, yes, I went to horse riding camp for 5 summers when I was a child. And you just assume, like, by the time you need me to be able to ride a horse, I will be able to ride a horse. Can you do a Polish accent? Absolutely. I went to Polish accent camp for 5 summers right? Like, whatever they're willing to pay you to do, as long as it doesn't conflict with your values, you say yes and you figure it out. And not only did this not conflict with my values, it was very much in alignment. And so I felt sure that I could figure it out. How little I knew. And so I started researching, and I started reading the books that in 2008 existed that could be said to be trans positive. And I immediately saw Will's concern. Many of them featured a trans kid or a kid who was gender non-compliant in some way, but they also included people being horrible to that child because they were gender independent or gender non-compliant in some way. And eventually the book usually turned itself around, and the children who were being horrible were told to stop, and they did. Sometimes it was the parents themselves who were not being super great to the gender independent kid, which was really heartbreaking. But taken together, I immediately understood Will's concern. They were as much a manual about bullying as they were books about gender independence. And sometimes they featured, the sort of acceptance by exception model, like Derek the Knitting Dinosaur, which is a real book. If you're not familiar, it's about Derek, a boy dinosaur who loves to knit. And all of the other dinosaurs give him a lot of static about that. And then the Ice Age happens, and suddenly everyone's like, Derek, can I get a hat? Right? So then it's fine that he's displaying this gender independent trait. But I really grasped what the problem was. And so I sat down and I wrote a couple of little stories that I thought would be good. And they featured parents being accepting and to some degree celebratory about their kids' genders. I went to the conference, I read them to the children and their parents. We did an extremely cute activity where the children attempted to illustrate the books, which resulted in just the most delightful illustrations. And then immediately afterward, the children went out to eat popsicles, and the parents swarmed me to say, where can I get this book? And I had to say, oh, well, it's not a I just made this in my house. But, I had at that point already written a couple of books for grown-ups. And so I thought, well, let me see about it. I submitted the manuscripts to a number of children's publishers. This is 2009. No one wanted them. They all said, versions of these are charming but too niche. No one will buy them. One editor said, these are so cute. If you ever write a book about normal children, I would love to see it. Not for the first time. I had an idea that maybe traditional publishing didn't know the best about what families would want. And so I decided that I would publish them myself. I went on Kickstarter. We raised a lot of money in a short amount of time. I hired illustrators. We released 2 books. And I really thought that was then the end of it, that people would now understand that there was a market and that these stories were valuable and that I could go back to writing essays for grown-ups, and that children's literature would take care of itself. Over the following year, 2 things happened. One, my husband and I had our first baby. And 2 books came out that were very highly touted to be great for trans or gender independent children. Jacob's New Dress and Morris Micklewhite and the Tangerine Dress. And they arrived and I read them and I just thought, this is the same, right? These are still kids who are gender independent or trans, and they are still being treated poorly because of it. We have to be able to do better. Then I started reading more into children's literature broadly, and I started to understand what the state of the field was in 2010. The Cooperative Children's Book Project out of the University of Wisconsin, they publish statistics every year about representation in children's books. And I started to read 94% of children's books centered or featured white children or white families. Fewer than 1% featured any characters in the 2S LGBTQ identity group. Fewer than 1% featured children who used mobility devices or were disabled. And I started to notice other things too, like all of these children had their own bedrooms in their own houses. Hardly anyone lived in an apartment building, unless it was a book about, the inner city, in which case you would see worrisome illustrations of children in houses that looked notably shabby. There were a lot of, every book had, heterosexual married parents. And more than that, the books that didn't were all in the category that I think of as very special episode books, right? Along with, A Mouse Goes to the Dentist, or even Dinosaurs Get Divorced. They were designed to introduce a potentially worrisome concept to children. And the ones that weren't that were sort of a little simple, right? The plot was some people have 2 moms, and that's not terrible. The end, which, great, but I didn't feel like they were doing what I wanted books to do, as I was then also reading to my actual human child every night. at a certain point, I encountered the work of the brilliant Black literacy educator, Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop, who talks about the idea that books are a mirror, a window, or a sliding glass door. And what I was able to understand through reading her work was that my objection to these books was that they were all designed with the window in mind. They were all designed as books that were supposed to show children a new, previously unconsidered experience that belonged to other people, and welcome them into the idea that those people exist. And I didn't love the vibe. I felt that my kid actually needed mirror books, books that were designed to show them their own life, their own experience in a way that was celebratory, positive, beautiful. And when I talked to other people who had children, and when I talked to other children, I was able to understand that my instinct was correct, that what we were missing in particularly in literature that was children's literature that was for 2S LGBTQ kids and families, but also a lot of families that weren't white and heterosexual and Christian and comprising entirely able-bodied people, and lived a middle-class lifestyle in the suburbs, was that almost all of the books that weren't featuring that family and those children were window books, not ever mirror books. Now, I'm Jewish, and I remember as a kid having to explain Judaism and Jewish holidays in school every year. Every year in the winter, I brought in a menorah and a plate of mini latkes, and I did a little shtick about what holiday we were celebrating. And then every year again in the spring, I went in with my Seder plate and a box of matzah, and I did it again. I was very good at the window style of presentation. I understood how to do it, but I also really understood the other side. There were no books on my shelf that featured Jewish children until I was old enough for All of a Kind Family. And, I'm 49 years old, right? So we're talking about the late 70s and early 80s. There are certainly more now, but my media landscape, books, television, movies, nobody was Jewish. And if they were Jewish, they certainly were not observing Jewish holidays, talking about Jewish topics, arguing about how to make the kugel, or, discussing their outfit for Shavuot. And together, the two experiences, my childhood experience of this sort of imagination desert, and my adult experience as a parent, trying very hard to disrupt that experience for my kid and having no way to do it, really ran me face first into the understanding that we just did not have the mirror books that we needed for queer and trans kids and communities and families. And so there's a thing that happens for me that my husband refers to as peak effort, which is when a situation, I now know enough about a situation to be really mad about it, and I can't do anything else but try to address it. And so in 2012, I sat down at my kitchen table with a legal pad and a lot of big feelings, and made the decision that I was going to go back to children's publishing and that I was going to try to publish other people's books, not just my own. And that what we really needed was to make sure that we were making mirror books for kids to see themselves reflected on the landscape of their imagination. And this is another reason why I really love librarians and libraries and all the people who get excited about books. When I say landscape of the imagination, you immediately know what I mean, right? You think about being a kid or working with kids and the way that if something's in a book, it's real in the world when they're little in a way that kind of nothing else approaches. Like books have an authority, even to children. And seeing themselves represented in a book allows them a place aware in the landscape of their imagination to project their own experience, right? When that landscape is full of other kinds of people, it can be really hard to set a course, if you will, right? They don't quite know how to sail their little ships in the same way. But when they can see families that look like theirs, experiences that look like theirs, holidays and celebrations, bodies, family styles, mobility devices, even as small a thing as the laundry room or the recycling room in an apartment building. It gives kids a sense that they too are real. And I will tell you another story about this at the end that let me know that I was on the right track. But there was a long part in the middle where I had very little idea about what I was doing in the technical sense. I didn't know anything about the publishing industry. I didn't know anything about printing. I was working through a print broker to get the books printed. And he asked me some questions about paper, and I said, I don't know, why don't you send me a sample of every kind? He said, that's 600 kinds. I was like, all right, well, here's a new thing that I get to learn about in the publishing industry. And I talked to booksellers, and I talked to parents, I talked to teachers and librarians and kids, and the same themes came up over and over again. One theme was the thing I had already understood and identified. And another theme that I hadn't really considered was, what does it mean to a kid when they do occasionally see themselves represented? And it's always in a situation where their identity is problematized. Right? Not just a problem for queer and trans and gender independent kids, but all of the children's books about indigeneity were about contact, residential schools. Those are very important books, but can they really be the only representations that we show children of their own or their families' experiences? Books that were about Black children were largely either about slavery in the United States, the enslavement of people who looked like them and the terrible treatment that they received, or they were sort of problematized inner city books that were typically about poverty or lack of access to resources. Kids who used mobility aids or were disabled, same. Kids whose parents were no longer married, same, right? The representation was kind of there, and people were very proud of those books. And I didn't and don't disagree that they should exist and are important. But I started to feel very uncomfortable with the idea that they were the only books available. And then I remembered that the only book I ever read in 12 years of school that included a Jewish protagonist was The Diary of Anne Frank. You all immediately knew which book, right? I didn't even have to say. Everyone listening went, oh, it's The Diary of Anne Frank, right? Like, and again, an important book that we absolutely need. But it can't be the only one. To me, the question of justice of the imagination is absolutely foundational to the wellness of children, right? We do a variety of things at home, in schools, in libraries, in community settings that we hope are welcoming, that we hope are inclusive. And when we do those things, we very often choose the best books that we are aware of that are available to present in those circumstances. And my concern wasn't that librarians didn't care or that school teachers didn't care. Sometimes that's true, but mostly I think they really do care. And it wasn't even that parents didn't care. In fact, I became acutely aware when I talked to parents who were, and whose families were anything other than white and heterosexual and Christian and able-bodied and middle class and living in the suburbs, that they were constantly looking for books that would show their children representations of their own lives and their own experiences. And most of what they were able to find were these sort of very special episode books, which, while better than nothing, didn't do the thing that we all as parents urgently wanted them to do, which was show a mirror that was not just nutritious, but also delicious, right? Many of the books that existed were sort of dutiful, and they were educational, but they were, and again, great, but they were not the kind of book that kids beg you to read over and over until you are sick of it. I can't tell you how many times I read Where is the Green Sheep, right? Until I could to this day recite, if you woke me from a dead sleep at 3 o'clock in the morning, I could recite the entirety of Where is the Green Sheep without even opening my eyes, right? Or, Happy Hippos Go Berserk, or Wild About Books, or any of the other children's books that are exciting and fun and feature kids or animals or people doing exciting things. And so when we started thinking about books for Flamingo Rampant, I thought, what about if these mirror books also had fun stories? What if kids got to, make a mess, make a friend, make a mistake, go to space, pretend to be a pirate, meet a dragon, all the things that kids adore in books, right? We don't read Knuffle Bunny or, Don't Let the Pigeon Drive the Bus because there are important concepts being related. We read them because they're ridiculous and hilarious and they're fun to read and children love them. And I wanted to make that. I wanted to make books where kids could not only see themselves, but see themselves loved, happy, excited, and weird, and, up to various nonsense, sneaking extra dessert and going where they were perhaps not, strictly speaking, authorized to go. It worked. And we made books and people bought books and I was excited about it, but I still found myself constantly making the case for why these books were different, why they were important, what they were valuable for, even to teachers and librarians who were comfortable with the books that they were already familiar with, especially to parents who were concerned about diversifying their kids' libraries, but weren't really sure how to go about it. We did a lot of consumer education, and over again, I returned to this concept of justice of the imagination. If justice in the real world is everyone having equity, right? And we've all seen the cartoon with the kids on the boxes peeking over the fence, what's, injustice, what is equal, what is equitable, right? And then what is justice, and it's where the fence is gone and everyone can watch the baseball game. But it's a little bit of a harder concept to explain when you're talking about imagination, right? And so I would sometimes use an analogy of, imagine that your child's imagination is a room populated with every character they are aware of, right? Or your student's imagination, or your library kid's imagination, to use the brilliant Michael Threet's language for it. Imagine that every character they've encountered on television, in the movies, and in books are all in the same big room, right? That room is full of Bluey and Doc McStuffins and the pigeon and everybody, right? I think it's easy to imagine that your child would be very excited to meet some of those characters. Maybe some because they feel very different, maybe some because they feel very similar. But if no character in that room looks like them or has an experience like theirs, then they don't get to have the same experience as a kid who walks into that room and sees that it is populated with a ton of characters who look just like them, whose families are just like theirs, whose experiences feel familiar and therefore comforting. That room has to contain, if we're going to do our best for kids, that room has to contain kid characters, adult characters that a child can see and think, oh, that kid's just like me. And so for me, the process has always been, I open the door to that room and go, okay, who's missing? What kids are not getting to see characters that are like them, that share their experience? When I buy books for my kids, I'm thinking about it. When I go to read at schools, I'm thinking about it. Who is missing in this landscape? And how do I make sure that as many kids as possible are getting the opportunity for that mirror experience? Now, we had early enthusiasm, but as a person who makes books and then sends them out into the world to sort of do their thing, I spent a lot of time wondering and worrying about whether I was doing a good job at it. I talked to the authors that we'd made books with, and they assured me that we were doing a good job. I talked to parents I knew. They assured me that we were doing a good job. I spent a lot of time that first year of publishing thinking about what we now sometimes talk about as own voices, right? Really wanting people to write from their own experience, really wanting the authors and illustrators to be drawing what they knew, writing about what they knew, especially because by then we were already starting to see a little bit more of a tick toward more racial diversity, certainly in children's books, but I felt very aware that they were written by the same people and that a certain number of them were just coloring kids sort of medium brown and hoping that that solved a racial diversity problem, which kind of better than nothing, but it still didn't give me the satisfaction that I wanted out of a mirror book. We released the books, we sent them to people. I got some fan mail in crayon, which was very encouraging. I would just like to say for the record, if you've never received fan mail in crayon, it is truly the best feedback in the world. And then I went to a conference. It was a huge trans conference that happens in the States in Philadelphia. It was my first day behind the table at the conference, in the conference vending area with 8 new queer and trans positive books. I was incredibly proud of them. We sold some, not a wild amount, but I was encouraged. And then at the very end of the day, something happened. I was just starting, it was 5 o'clock. I was just starting to think about packing up. Some of the other vendors were starting to pack up. And I heard, how 6-year-olds sometimes speak in a carrying tone that you can hear from like 2 city blocks away. If any of you have children, you have certainly had an experience of this. Often it happens at the worst possible moment. And you just like, right? But you know that they can hear what your kid is saying from 3 aisles of the grocery store over. And the child's voice was saying, "Daddy, come with me." And so I looked in the direction of the voice and I saw the child from whom it was emanating, and it was a little 6-year-old. And she was holding the hand of her dad. And just to set the scene for you, because the visual was so arresting, she was on the smaller side of 6, and her dad was roughly the size of an industrial refrigerator, like 6 feet 6 inches tall, 350 pounds, like professional basketball player size. And she was fully at a 45-degree angle, holding his hand, pulling with every ounce of her 6-year-old strength, trying to tow him in the direction that she wanted. And he said, "Okay," and started to move, right? What she couldn't accomplish by physical force, love managed. And so with her tiny hand in his giant hand, she towed him right over to our table. And she took his gigantic catcher's mitt size hand and she put it down on a book called Love is in the Hair, which is by the amazing artist and writer and general duty fabulous person, Dr. Cyrus Marcus Ware. And it was one of our first books that we made. And it's a beautiful little story for like preschool, kindergarten, first grade, about a kid who is home overnight with her gay uncles because her parents are at the hospital having her little sister and she can't sleep. And so her uncles make her warm milk and they tell her stories about her family and their love story through the objects that are woven into their dreadlocks. And the man had thick dreadlocks down to his waist, what some people call life locks. And the little girl had tiny, perfect, very slender dreadlocks. And I understood why we were looking at this book. Earlier in the day, I had gone over to the children's area of the conference and dropped off some children's books for them to read. She'd clearly seen it and now wanted to show her dad. So he looks at me and sort of nods hello. I nod hello. I can see that he's a little skeptical about the entire situation, and frankly, I do not blame him. And then he opens up the book and starts to read. And he gets to about the third page, and he starts to cry. Tears are pouring down his cheeks as he silently turns the pages of this book. I companionably also start to cry because I understand what is happening for him, right? I'm gonna get teared up now. Sorry, / not that sorry. I understand that, we all understand that love and grief are two sides of the same coin, right? And that grief is what happens when your love has nowhere to go anymore. But I don't think we understand as much what it looks like when we are holding a grief that is about love with nowhere to go, and then suddenly it has a place to go. And I realized in that moment that I was watching it happen in real time. He got to the end of the book and closed it, and he turned to the little girl and said, "Baby, you were right. Thank you for showing me this." And then he looked at me and said, "I will take 10. And I sort of nodded and said, "Absolutely." And then he started telling her who they were for. "We'll have one at home. We'll send one to your school. One's for church. One's for Uncle so-and-so. One's for Auntie so-and-so. We'll keep an extra for this person. I'm going to send one to Grandma." I packaged up his books. I gave him a discount. I handed him his books. He said thank you and shook my hand and left. And that was the moment that I tell this story because I think it's all very well to theorize about justice. I think it's good to talk about children and imagination and what it means and the value of the mirror and all the rest of it. But having seen the thing happen in the real world, I was truthfully changed forever, right? We've made a bunch more books since then, but that is the moment that I always think of when I talk about justice of the imagination and the power of celebration. This adult and this child having their first experience of a beautiful book that showed them a mirror to their own experience and how it changed everything for all of us that day. When I talk to librarians about choosing books to acquire, to read, to deaccession, the thing I always want to ask you to think about is that, right? I want to ask you to think about the mirror, about the moment that you are uniquely able to provide to children and sometimes to parents, where they get to see themselves beautiful for the first time. And I welcome your questions and I welcome your thoughts. And I really appreciate the fact that this is something that we get to do together now. I am so grateful to be able to do this work and to be able to do it with you all. Thank you. Deep breath. Oh no, Erin, did I make you cry?
Yeah, just a little bit there.
Sorry, and also I'm
No, do not be sorry for one moment, because it's so true. It reminded me of it's one of those things where you want to believe that it's true, but then when it happens to you, like, it's the first time I found a book inside a book in my library, right? It's the first time I actually had a student say to me, I never thought I would see myself in a book. And I sat there in front of her too and went, it's due on April 9th, like what can you, we have to take those moments. So thank you. You made me laugh as well, and you made me cry as well. So it's beautiful. Let's see. I see some stuff coming into the chat and Q&A. Kelly says, no questions, just a significant amount of thank you for being you and for sharing your knowledge. Andrea says, that was the most incredible description of own voice I've ever heard. Thank you. And she is also crying.
I really understand that is a very happy cry story, and
Yes.
and I always get choked up every time I tell it. I do not blame anyone. I tell it in part for that reason, right? In part because I think, we can theorize about things, we can read academic papers, we can read guidance and best practices all day and intellectually, logically understand, yes, this is important. I have read the thing, I get it.
Yes.
And I read so much in the process of doing my own work about books, and particularly children's books, but it wasn't until I had the experiences that I had that I felt like I grasped it on that, in my feelings place.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
I think we have 10 or 15 minutes for questions. So people should feel free, and I won't take it on a referendum of if I did a good job. People don't have questions. I know it's a lot to think about, but if there are questions, please feel free to either put them in the Q&A box, or you can unmute yourself and appear on screen and ask your question in person. Well, you know what I mean, in person. That is also.
Yes, wonderful. I do have one question to get us started, and it's one that I have been curious about since I started doing my research. Why flamingo rampant? Is that a story you can share?
Yes, it is a story I can share. I would like to say for the record that if I had understood at the beginning that this was going to be a thing, I would not have called it that. So,
I mean, it conjures so many wonderful images.
Flamingo rampant is a family joke between me and my husband. So I am a lot of a nerd. That may not be a shock to anyone listening. And my husband and I both work a lot around equity and justice topics, particularly related to us LGBTQ issues. And there was a day very early on in our relationship where we were joking around that at the moment, almost all of the household income was um, because we were doing queer and trans related work. And I, because I am a little bit of a heraldry nerd also, I said we should do a logo. He said we should do a logo, and I said we should do a coat of arms.
Yeah.
Crossed iPhones and a flamingo rampant. So in heraldry terms, when an animal is described as rampant, it means that half of their feet are off the ground. So if you look at like the coat of arms of the royal family, for example, you will see lions rampant. Yes, Julia, exactly so. Yeah, Julia just said that, yeah. And so flamingos rampant just seemed hilarious. And then, whatever, I don't know, a year later, we were getting ready to publish these first two books, The Adventures of Tulip, Birthday Wish Fairy, and Backwards Day, these two little trans books that I'd written originally for this conference. And I needed a name for the publishing company in order to register them for an ISBN with Library and Archives Canada, another thing that I have learned about in my publishing journey. And so I typed in flamingo rampant because I thought it was great and funny. And then we were stuck with it.
Yeah.
Which is fine, except that people regularly are like, flaming what? Flamingo rampart? Flamingo rampant is just a very funny phrase. And I probably would have put my branding hat on and made a different choice if I had known what I was doing, but I definitely didn't. And so I just went with the family joke, flamingo rampant. Here we are, 28 years later, flamingo rampant. So
Wonderful.
that's what happened there.
Thank you. A couple more comments. That was very moving and insightful. Thank you for sharing that story. Also, wow. Thank you so much, Bear. You are so funny, lovely, and empathetic.
That's lovely.
All true. Very much so. Another question that I have. In the article I mentioned, the one that sort of brought you into my world, you wrote that in March of last year. And I was just curious, have you seen any changes in the situation between March of last year and now? Do you see an upswing to the positive? What do you know?
Okay. I wish I did, but no.
Yeah.
In fact, it's extremely clear to me that things are getting worse on multiple axes. And, I have only anecdotal evidence of this, mostly, because it's really too soon for research. But I am pretty plugged into the Canadian literary landscape as an author, as a publisher, and it's clearly getting worse. We're back to book challenges in schools. We're back to, things that are overt like that. But there's also there's a lot happening that's just slightly below the surface. One of the things is that most of the queer and trans writers I know don't get invited to do school visits anymore because the schools don't want to deal with the possible fallout. Drag queen story hours, which used to be like the most delightful pride programming ever, are now not only being protested, but bomb threats are getting called in. And that's not just happening in the US, it's happening in Canada too. Or, security is needed to keep library patrons safe from agitators who are outside and yelling. I have personally had multiple experiences last year and the year before of parents pulling their children out when they hear that I'm going to be reading to the kindergarten class about, such controversial topics as birthdays. I know it's a lot to imagine a kid having to hear about a birthday celebration. Here we are. And this year, this entire academic year, I have received 0 invitations for school assemblies or to read to school children. In previous years, I or other Flamingo Rampant authors would have received a couple of dozen easily. So it's clear that there's a real chilling effect that happens from these protests and from these attempts to remove or ban books. I also hear from public librarians that a thing that is happening is that parents will go to the library, check out every book on the Pride display, and then never bring them back. That rather than issue a formal challenge, they will simply take all the books home and then destroy them, so that the library can't circulate them during Pride Month. There has been It's interesting to me that what feels like a very small group of people are able to create so much fear in libraries and schools. And at the same time, I understand it. Like, school teachers are not prepared for parents protesting or outside the school or yelling in the office about their indoctrination or whatever that business is, as though queer and trans people don't exist or shouldn't be, right? There is also this question of, I hear this thing a lot about like the innocence of children and how it needs to be protected. All these parents saying, my child is too young to know about racism, right? You know who never says that? Parents of children of color. Because you know what's true about their experience? They never get to decide when it's a good time to teach their children about racism, because the rest of the outside world will teach them about it when it is ready, not when those parents are ready. Ditto homophobia, ditto anti-indigeneity, ableism, fat phobia, sexism and misogyny, you name it, right? The people who can make the decision about when to introduce topics around equity and justice to their kids are people who are not personally impacted by those choices. That innocence that those parents are excited to yell about only exists in families where there is little or no possibility that those children will themselves be the targets of racist or homophobic or trans antagonists or ableist or misogynist behavior, right? And so when I remember that sort of vaunted innocence that certain parents are excited to protect is actually just perhaps the biggest manifestation of privilege, I feel a lot less sympathetic to their won't somebody think of the children wailing and gnashing of teeth.
Yes, absolutely. The clutching of pearls. We have one question, and then I think we probably have to wrap things up. But this one is from Pascal, and she asks, how do you feel about labeling books with rainbow stickers to help students find books that might be of interest to them? And she says that in consultation with students in her school, she's getting sort of a 50-50 split on the answers to that question. And Sarah also has a quick question. Have you considered translating your publications into French?
I'll answer the easy question first. We do have one French book, which is by a Quebec author, Sophie Labelle. She wrote both it's not a translation. She wrote both an English version and a French version. In English, it's Rachel's Christmas Boat. And in French, it's, please forgive me, I was educated in the US and I took Latin. It's Rachel et son bateau de Noël. And it's an adorable story about a little girl whose parent comes out to her as trans right before Christmas, and she becomes very concerned that her parents' Christmas presents won't have the parents' new name on them. So for a lot of shenanigans that involve glitter and too much tape to retrofit all of the existing presents so that they say Rachel and not her parents' former name. And then she decides that perhaps Santa will not have had gotten the message. So she enlists the help of her friend William, and they go searching for a way to get Santa Claus this message. It is adorable.
It sounds delightful.
Really, really cute. It's a real heist story in its way. Art supplies are slightly overused. As far as rainbows on books, it's really a question that I very much agree with you cuts both ways. Where kids who are trying to figure out which books are maybe the rainbow books find it helpful, but then some kids can't take those books home, and children are typically aware very early whether it is or is not safe to bring those books home, in exactly the same way that a 3-year-old knows which parent to ask for an extra cookie. Like, who's more likely to say yes to a trip to the park, and who's more likely to say yes to, a trip to the trampoline place or whatever, right? Like, kids are savvy. I don't really have an opinion on which is better. Although I do think that, some people have had success with things like a rainbow bookmark so that it can be removed. I've even seen some queer YA novels having 2 covers, one of which is sort of very readably queer, and one of which is much more anodyne. So that kids who want to read a book but don't want other people to know that they're reading that book, that for older kids, obviously, have that option. I think to some degree it's a know your population question, and I think to some degree it's just a sign of the current exhausting climate for all of us, for which I have a lot of empathy, but there's not, unfortunately, a one-size-fits-all solution to how to make it work. I wish there was. I wish I had a magical great idea, but this question comes up a lot, and rainbow bookmark is the best solution that anyone has had so far, or like in a tub or on a shelf marked with a rainbow, but the book itself is not marked with a rainbow. I've seen that. Mary?
That's wonderful. And yeah, Pascal says thanks. She loves the idea of the bookmark, and I fully understand that as well. That goes back to that book inside a book, that I found once in the library and kept finding, sort of in the same area for repeated lunch hours. Right? That's wonderful. Thank you, everyone. It is already after 3:00. So I'm afraid that time has come, and I'm not going to cry again. But I just want to say, Bear, thank you. Thank you for being with us here this afternoon. I honestly, I can't think of a better way to say this other than I am so grateful that all my paths brought me here to this moment to meet you
Same.
and to hear that. So, whew, I said it wasn't. So thank you so much for your time and for bringing such a thoughtful and meaningful presentation for us to end our day together. Thank you. Ha.
Thank you
Thank
for
you again.
I really appreciate it. I appreciate all of you and your work and your thoughtfulness and your attention and your career path, a lot, very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you again to LCEQ for hosting us this afternoon, and to Petros again for your technical assistance. Thank you as well to Julian Taylor for your part in the technical aspects of this afternoon.